So Russell, we're going to be recording. So let me just start again to say that one of the great pleasures, hear me out, folks. One of the great pleasures about coming to the annual meeting is to have all of you here to hear the kind of authors and historians and wonderful people who come and speak to all of us about our history. And we're really pleased tonight to have Russell Shorto, who is going to talk to us about an upcoming book and about his work on the history of this area and the Dutch and the English at the time. So let me just give you a little brief introduction to Russell. Russell was born in Jonestown, Pennsylvania. He has written 7 books of narrative history, drawn in part from his belief that history is most meaningful when explored through individuals in conflict. His books have been published in 14 languages and have won numerous awards. While they're all wonderful, 2 that I really want to call out. The first, the book is The Island at the Center of the World, which is the story of the Dutch origins of New York City. Russell, you can tell people are totally excited about your books. What can I say? What can I say? The second, and this is a little bit for Connie, is The Revolution Song, A Story of American Freedom, which tells the story of the American Revolution through the eyes of 6 Americans from vastly different walks of life. And as everybody knows, Connie has been leading the charge on all of our efforts to celebrate the 250th anniversary of the Revolution, which is next year?
Almost.
Almost. I'm getting close. Yeah, okay. All right. Enough of that cap living. In 2009, Russell was given a knighthood by the Dutch government for advancing Dutch-American historical awarenesses. So this is the first time I know that we have a knight who's going to be talking to all of us. There you go. So, yeah. In 2018, he was inducted into the New York State Writers Hall of Fame. He is currently the director of the new Amsterdam Project at the New York Historical Society, a senior scholar at the new Netherland Institute, and a contributing writer at the New York Times Magazine. And so with that, Russell, I'm going to turn it over to you. Let me just get rid of stop my video, and go ahead and share, Russell, and get going, okay?
Okay, Chet, you turned off your video and now I can't see people. Can you turn it back on?
Yes, so let me do that. Let me turn my...
Otherwise,
video.
I feel like I'm talking to myself.
Okay, well then fine. I think when you share your screen, it'll be perfect.
Okay, that's great. So everyone can see and hear me?
Yes.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Chet, for a generous introduction. Thank you all for coming out in the rain, and I apologize for not being there in person. I think this is the 3rd time that I've been at the Irvington Historical Society. The other 2 were in person. And I especially want to thank Pat Bonamy, my old friend, for inviting me and months ago talking to me about coming. And I knew then, I said to her that I'm working on this book. The deadline is the end of the year. In the beginning of December, I'm going to be so pressed for time, I'm not going to want to, leave. And she very kindly said, well, then do it via Zoom. So thank you very much for that, Pat. As Chet said, I wrote a book long ago, almost 20 years ago, The Island at the Center of the World, about the Dutch founding of a colony which gave so much to what would become New York, not just New York City, but the whole region, and really to America as well. I slowly have come around to working on the book that I'm trying to finish now, which is, I guess in a way, kind of a sequel to it. It will be called Taking Manhattan. And there are really 2 takings of Manhattan. The first one is when the Dutch took it from the Native Americans. And the second is when the English took it from the Dutch. And the book that I'm working on deals with both of them. It's mostly the story of this showdown between the English and the Dutch in the late summer of 1664 when they're both pointing their guns at one another and it looks like they're going to do battle, and they have been doing battle over properties all over the world for a long time. And instead, something else happens. And so I will talk about that shortly. What I thought I would do, though, is I put together some slides, especially since I thought that would be more interesting than, just looking at my face on a computer screen. And I thought that what I would do is kind of summarize the Dutch coming to this region and interactions with Native Americans, and then talk about the new book. And in between, as Chet mentioned, I'm the director of the New Amsterdam Project at the New York Historical Society. And one thing that we're doing next year, talking about anniversaries, next year is the 400th anniversary of the founding of New Netherland by the Dutch. And so there are a number of activities taking place to commemorate that. And I'm curating a museum exhibit at the New York Historical Society. I've never curated a museum exhibit before, so we'll see how it goes. But I thought I would give you as well a kind of a taste of what that exhibit will be. It will open on March 15th of next year. So I will, without any further ado, try to share my screen. And does that work? Do you see the screen?
Works perfect.
Okay, great. So this is, I don't know if you all are familiar with the work of Len Tantillo. Len is a wonderful history painter. He lives up right across the river from Albany. And he researches his paintings as meticulously as any academic historian researches a book. And this is his view of New Amsterdam at the foot of Manhattan Island in 1660. So every image here is every house and so on is meticulously researched. So I thought this was an appropriate starting point. Now, when I started on my book, The Island at the Center of the World, 20 some years ago, very few people were thinking about New York's Dutch period. I know Pat Bonamy was. She was one of the few historians who was really focused on the colonial period and going back to the Dutch period. And what it meant for New York and for America. I became interested in it, and I became intrigued by what seemed to be kind of a received wisdom that there wasn't much to go on. And this quote, kind of sums that up. This is from a historian in the early 20th century. Original sources of information concerning the early Dutch settlers of Manhattan Island are neither many nor rich, for the Dutch wrote very little, and on the whole, their records are meager. Now, in fact, we now know that the official correspondence of the colony of New Netherland runs to 12,000 pages of material, court cases, council minutes, correspondence, and these two people have changed history, Charles Gehring and Yanni Venema. Charlie has been translating and publishing the records of New Netherland since 1974. Yanni joined him in 1984. A few years ago, Yanni retired, so she really devoted her career to it. Charlie is still at it in Albany. And this is just a couple of pages of the records to give you a little flavor of it. They're weathered by time. They survived the 1911 fire in the state Capitol building. You can see they were eaten by worms, and they've been through a lot. That's Charlie in earlier times. So my book, the only reason I wrote it was because of their work. And so many people who are now working in this burgeoning field of New Netherland studies are dependent on their work, on their translations and the publications. And it's now, of course, all available online as well. I thought I would quickly summarize the story of New Netherland, which, of course, begins with Henry Hudson. an English mariner who sailed up the river that now bears his name. He had been sailing, he had done a number of voyages for an English company called the Muscovy Company, which, as the name suggests, its main business was with Russia, the fur trade there. As furs were being trapped out in Russia, people were looking for other supplies. And so he was looking for that as well. Meanwhile, the Dutch, who were on and off again enemies of the English in the 17th century, were looking for a mariner who would find a short route to Asia for them. And they invited him to Amsterdam in 1608 in the winter to this building. This was the headquarters of the Dutch East India Company. It's now administrative building of the University of Amsterdam. And he met with them and signed a contract that he would look for a short route to Asia. Now, they wanted him to go east around above Russia. He basically ignored that order and went west, thinking that there was a short route through North America. So this blue line gives you indication of the journey he took as he's trying to find what he believed would be a channel through North America. And you can see him meandering, looking for this channel. What he ended up doing, which was not at all what he had in mind, was charting this section of the Northeast on behalf of the Dutch. So once he went back to Europe, because he did this under Dutch auspices, the Dutch laid claim to this whole swath of territory and called it New Netherland. So we move forward a few years, and the Dutch West India Company is founded. This was their headquarters. This building is still standing in Amsterdam. Just as an aside, for several years, I was director of the American Culture Center in Amsterdam, which is housed in this building. So a friend of mine who had read my book, The Island at the Center of the World, said, it's like you crawled up inside your own book. So it was really special to actually work in this building. So from this building, the directors of the company planned out this colony of New Netherland. That orange line is more or less the extent of New Netherland. People have a vague idea, which is understandable because the boundaries always changed. But you can see right away that the Dutch were always focused on water and waterways. And what attracted them here were the three river systems, the Delaware, the Hudson, and the Connecticut, and really the Hudson then connecting to the Mohawk. So because of that, they felt, and they were right, they had a real foothold, not just on the coast, but into the interior of the continent. So they built their capital of New Amsterdam in 1626, and this is a lovely watercolor that was painted in about 1660. This is the same geography, more or less, today. All of the area around the perimeter of Lower Manhattan is landfill. So I assume you can see my pointer here, but this was basically New Amsterdam. And to give you another orientation, here's Manhattan Island, and you can see here the original coastline, how curvy and crenellated it was. This is New Amsterdam down here. And the wall at Wall Street there to keep the English out. You see many of the features, New Harlem up here, the Wakaskek Road, which the lower part of it became Broadway. The Wakaskek, by the way, were the tribe that originally inhabited what's now Irvington. This is the Dutch were the great cartographers of the 17th century, and this map, there were 28 different versions of this map done over about a 100-year period. It was considered the finest map of the Northeast. And it shows how the Dutch, I mean, if you look at it, you feel like, oh, this is a very settled landscape. In fact, they were very thinly settled throughout. And if you look at that, basically that same geography from another vantage point, you see that in fact, it was intricately peopled by Native Americans. The people called the Delaware, there were of the main groups in New Netherland, and I've become, as we all have, I think, who deal with American colonial history, much more focused on the Native American presence and interactions than I used to be. So the two main groups were what we used to call the Iroquois, and now what's preferred is Haudenosaunee, which is their own term. The Haudenosaunee were the nations across upstate New York, the Seneca, Cayuga, Onondaga, Oneida, and Mohawk. And then the people in and around New York City and Westchester and New Jersey are harder to kind of grapple with and get a handle on because they go by many names. They don't, even today, the people themselves don't agree on nomenclature. The Delaware, the Lenni Lenape, the Lenape, well, there are many names. So this just gives you, I don't know if you have a chance, if you've never been to Gonondagan, which is a New York State history site. It is a Seneca history location, and they have a beautiful display inside the main building, but in back they have a replica of a Haudenosaunee longhouse. And when you're inside it, you really start to get this culture. There was this whole culture, which of course, I mean, the people are still here, but they don't live this way anymore. But it really begins to give you a sense of the fullness of the culture. Okay, back to this. There you see what the Dutch called New Netherland. And here you see what they were initially there for. Furs, especially beavers. So from these river systems, they would barter with Native American tribes for furs. Then they would ship them to Manhattan, and New Amsterdam was the entrepot, the global port city that had connections to the wider world. So from there, they would ship them to Europe. That was the name of the game for a long period of time. So initially, Peter Minuit was the director who decided that the capital would be at Lower Manhattan, and they would call it New Amsterdam. This document is essentially New York City's birth certificate. We don't have the deed that the Dutch signed with a branch of the Munsee people, but a few months later, when the next ship from Manhattan returned to Europe, a government official on the dock briefed the government about what was on the ship, and this first report really from New Amsterdam. And he said, yesterday the ship arrived here. It sailed from New Netherland. They report that our people are in good spirit and live in peace. The women have borne some children. They have purchased the island Manhattans from the Indians for the value of 60 guilders. So that's the kind of thing that jumps out at you now. And then he gives a list there. You see on the bottom, he lists how many different kinds of furs, of otter, mink, and so on, were on the ship. But for our purposes, that's what jumps out at us, this purchase, which I could spend a whole talk on this, and I promise I won't, but the idea that the Dutch believed they were purchasing the island, the native tribe with whom they interacted and held a ceremony did not believe that. They didn't have the same concept of a property purchase. They believed they were entering into something like a defensive alliance, saying you can live here as well, we'll continue to live here, and if either of us is attacked, the other one will assist. So the value of 60 guilders, which in the 19th century, a translator converted into then dollars, $24, that's the myth of buying Manhattan for $24, was never by either side meant to be a purchase amount. It was goods, kettles and knives and useful items that were meant to kind of seal this compact between them. One of the most remarkable things about the settlement was its pluralistic nature. The Dutch pioneered the concept of tolerance in Europe. They also, by the way, pioneered intolerance in the form of the slave trade, which we'll get to in a moment. So the Dutch Republic was an unusually mixed society. In Europe, people thought that you had to be united, especially in terms of a state religion. Otherwise, society would break down. The Dutch flew in the face of that. They had this policy of tolerance of other faiths, and that then helped to seed what would become New York's melting pot society. So this slide represents one couple. They were French. And you see Joris Rapalje. They were poor French people who emigrated to Amsterdam and from there to New Amsterdam. And his wife, Catalina Trico. And you can see here, they were both illiterate. They made their marks here. The church is they were Walloons from what's now Belgium. And they got married in the Walloon church in Amsterdam, which still stands on the Oudezijds Voorburgwal. And then a couple of days later, they boarded the ship and went to Manhattan. The story, as I tell the story of New Netherland in the island at the center of the world, I really focus on the confrontation between these two fellows. On the left is Peter Stuyvesant, who was the last director of the colony, who ran it for 17 years. On the right is Adrian van der Donck, who led a kind of people's opposition party to West India Company rule. And this clash between the two of them really kind of laid out it was about what this colony could become. And van der Donck, in the book that he wrote, was very prescient in talking about how because we Dutch have this tolerance, we have this mix of people here, and this mix of people one day, we're on this island that's astride this continent that's so vast we don't know how far it goes. That mix of people, our free trade ethic in this place, great things will come. But he said in his book, if we don't support the colony, the English will take it. And so he was remarkably prescient in thinking about what would be American history. So this is the book he wrote, A Description of New Netherland, and that is the title page of the Dutch edition. There were two editions published in 1655 and 56. And this is how many Europeans first heard of a place called Manhattan. And it became popular enough that hundreds of people then emigrated to Manhattan and became part of the mix. So New Amsterdam, in a nutshell, there were famously 18 languages spoken when there were only about 500 people there. In fact, there were probably more like 25 or so languages, because that estimate surely did not include African languages and Native American languages. This picture up here is the stock exchange in Amsterdam, the world's first stock exchange. The Dutch were the pioneers of capitalism, as we would call it. And so it's not at all a coincidence that Wall Street became the center of American commerce. And this image here, the Costello Plan, shows you New Amsterdam at its height, this burgeoning little community, this port city in which 20-some languages are spoken, and everybody is a trader, essentially. So those two things, and this is what I argued in Island at the Center of the World, those two things together lay the foundation for what would become New York City. In 1664, this strapping gent, the Duke of York, sends a flotilla of gunships led by a man named Richard Nichols, and they take over the colony. More about that in a second. And New Amsterdam becomes New York, Beverwijk becomes Albany, but a lot of places retain their Dutch roots. Haarlem, Brooklyn, Staten Island is named for the States General. Long Island, the Dutch named. So on and on goes the Dutch, and place names are only the beginnings of the Dutch Dutch influence on American history. Now, I said I wanted to just give you a little taste of this exhibit that I'm putting together. It will be called New York Before New York, the Costello Plan of New Amsterdam. So this is the Costello Plan, which I showed you a minute ago. It is a remarkably detailed map of New Amsterdam at its height. It was, this painting was bought by the Grand Duke of Tuscany in 1667. And it was hung in his Villa de Castello. That's why it's called the Costello Plan. It is still in Florence, in Italy, and so we have gotten it on loan. It's very rare that it has traveled. We've gotten it on loan for the exhibit, and the city fathers of New Amsterdam commissioned this, and at the same time a census. So putting those two together, we know that there's 300 and some odd houses, 16 streets. We know the names of all the owners of the houses. We know how much they paid, often how much they paid to maintain, that they had to, you see the two canals here. If you lived on the canal, you had to pay to keep the frontage in front of your property. We know how they paid for that. So incredibly detailed. You see here the wall, by the way, this is pointed so that this south is to the left here. So the tip of the island, we would normally think of it as turned. But this is the wall at what became Wall Street. This is the fort, and this was the original Indian Trail, which the Dutch then called the Herenweg, the Gentleman's Way, and then the English called Broadway. This is what I was showing you a moment ago. This is the actual letter that Peter Schagen, the government official, wrote to the directors saying, we have purchased the island. And so we are getting this on loan from the Dutch National Archives in The Hague. We'll have this actual sort of birth certificate of New York. This painting that I showed you, the Vingbones watercolor illustration of New York, just at the moment, he got a drawing and then made his painting. He was in Amsterdam, and as he was doing it, they got word that the English had taken over and it was now called New York. So you see up the top, New Amsterdam, or what's now, I guess they're now calling it New York, on the island of Manhattan. We are getting this on loan as well. New York Historical Society has many iterations of this map. This one of the most influential maps of colonial America. We'll have one of the rarest on display. The portrait of Peter Stuyvesant will have on display. One of the windows from the church, a copy of Adrian van der Donk's book, many documents from the period. This was a property deed to Manuel de España, who was an enslaved African who was given his freedom. And then typically when they freed, if they freed an enslaved person, they gave them a portion of land so that they could work, so that they could then pay off. They had to pay the company for their freedom. Other important documents of the period. The exhibit also, it tries to tell not just the Dutch story, not just the European story, but also an African story and the Native American story. This on the left here is a remarkable find archaeologists found in 1984 outside the home of Cornelis van Tienhoven in New Amsterdam. This is a plaster cast of a basket that was buried under the ground. This collection of objects was in it, and the plate was on the top. It is what is called an impungu. It's done ceremonially for healing. It could be to heal an individual, it could be to heal a family or a whole community. Every one of these objects, every object in this religious belief is alive, and every object has certain vibrations, and a healer knows how to manipulate them. So this collection of objects had a particular kind of meaning. We'll have this on display. This image, this engraving has fascinated scholars for a long time. It is believed to be a Munsee man from the area around perhaps Irvington. And he was captured during Kieft's War and brought to Europe by two Dutch soldiers who put him on display as, for money. They charged people to look at him. This is representation, one type of longhouse village, which shows, I think it contrasts nicely or compares nicely with the Castello plan itself. It's a very orderly village that certain tribes lived in. I'm coming back to a map of what was essentially New Netherland and highlighting it in a different way. The Dutch, as I said earlier, the Dutch were very focused on waterways. They knew the landscape in terms of water, and they knew that the beaver trade was a short-term prospect. Ultimately, and Adrian van der Donk in his book alluded to this, they knew that the Hudson River went up north, and it formed a confluence with the Mohawk River, and that ultimately they knew from the Haudenosaunee that went all the way to these vast bodies of water. So they saw that was the future, that, you know, of course, there were no highways. To get west, to get to the American interior, you had to do it via waterways. And of course, then in the 1820s, when the Erie Canal was built, when it opened up the Mohawk River and made it navigable, suddenly what the Dutch in the 1600s envisioned began to become true. So that's when New York City takes off in its industrial era might, and Albany and the cities around it, Troy and Schenectady, take off. And then the Great Lakes, all the cities around the Great Lakes, Chicago, Duluth, Detroit, they all blossom. So there's this wonderful sense in which, you know, this handful, really, a few thousand settlers in the 1600s were dreaming of something, and American history then later made it come about. So now to my book that I'm working on now. It'll be called Taking Manhattan: The Story of New York's Birth. I'm giving you there a couple of images to orient you. When I told the story of New Netherland in the island at the center of the world, I was telling essentially a Dutch story. What has preoccupied me now with this book is New York wasn't just a Dutch city, obviously. It then became English. And what I have come to appreciate is how New York, first of all, New York, unusual. A lot of cities just develop naturally. New York was planned. The Dutch said, we're going to plant a city here. They called it New Amsterdam. And then came this confrontation. The Dutch and the English, as I said, had confronted one another throughout the 17th century. There were these two rising powers in Europe. The Dutch, to this outpost, they brought this notion of tolerance. They also brought intolerance. They began the slave trade. The first slaves probably arrived in 1627, so just a couple of years after New Amsterdam began. And they brought this free trading ethic, and this was in the 1620s. By the 1660s, New Amsterdam is growing, and it's doubling in size and then doubling again, and it is shipping goods from Manhattan to the Caribbean, to Europe, and it's also shipping from New England and Virginia. So the English to the north and the south learned that the Dutch were so good, their tariffs were so low, they were efficient. It was often better for them to ship via New Amsterdam, which galled the government in London to the extent that they passed laws forbidding this. So then in 1664, let me pause a second. I have to look at the time. The 17th century in England is marked by this vast strife, civil strife, between two factions of society, the kind of mainstream and then this Puritan sect, which really I think we would have to look at today as kind of a religious cult that slowly gains power and ultimately then clashes with the government and other elements of society in the English Civil War. And that culminates with the Puritans taking control of power. Oliver Cromwell becomes the leader. They behead King Charles I. So, you know, the whole backdrop to New York's or to England's founding of its American colonies is this civil strife. So the New England colonies, especially Boston and the Massachusetts Bay Colony, were these hotbeds of Puritanism. Now, in 1660, the sons of the beheaded king win power again. The monarchy comes back. The Stuarts are on the throne, and it isn't just the people who supported the royals weren't just royalists and believers in monarchy. They were also sort of the middle of the road people. They were the moderates. They were also, in many ways, they were the people who founded the Royal Society. They were the proponents of science. So there's this clash between hardcore religious extremism and science, reason, moderation that is at play too. So the Stuarts come back onto the throne. They say, we have to deal with these upstarts in New England, these Puritans. And by the way, we want to get the Dutch out of the way in this whole territory that they've captured. So they send this flotilla of ships. The 4 ships, about 450 men under a man named Richard Nichols, arrive. And let me switch here. And hold on. So they arrive in the late summer of 1664. Crossing the Atlantic, they got separated. The 4 ships got separated. They regrouped, and then they got lost, separated again, coming down the coast of the Northeast. So it was only Richard Nichols' ship, the flagship, that comes down, you know, if you can imagine, if you follow my cursor, comes down from New England, where they originally landed, into New York Harbor. And he's now in a very tricky position because he came with what he thought was going to be a substantial group of soldiers, but now it's only his one ship, and he's entering enemy territory. So he comes in and tucks here behind this peninsula and hopes that the other ships are going to come. Meanwhile, the Dutch are here at New Amsterdam, and they are getting word from their scouts that they have throughout the harbor. This is about a distance of about 20 miles, that the English are here. At the time, Peter Stuyvesant was up north near around what's now Albany. So he's hurrying south. So what happens then over the next few days is the other ships, English ships, come, and Stuyvesant comes back. And then these 4 ships head toward New Amsterdam. They don't go immediately to New Amsterdam, though. They put in here at Gravesend Bay, about 10 miles away. And then over the course of the next 10 days, the English under Richard Nichols and the Dutch under Peter Stuyvesant commence sending messengers back and forth in small boats. And this, I don't have time to go into it, but this is what most interests me in the book I'm writing now, because we all know, oh, the Dutch, you know, the English came, the Dutch gave up, and it became New York. What was going on was something much more complicated. The English, Richard Nichols represented the English, but the English were not a monolith. They were not united. The English in New England, he knew, were essentially his enemies. They were the Puritans. He represented the Stuarts. He represented this moderate branch. And the Dutch, at the same time, had learned over the previous years that what should have been their support system in the home country, the Dutch West India Company, was ignoring them. They were not sending reinforcements. So in this back and forth that takes place in 10 days, the English and the Dutch are eyeing each other, and they're learning about each other, and they're coming to appreciate that they have more in common than they think. The English here represent this moderate strain. The Dutch were in Europe, the ultimate practical, business-minded people. So what they effected was something almost like a corporate merger. So they decided, and they agreed to this. They laid out these articles of transfer where the colony would transfer to English auspices, but in other ways, it would essentially remain Dutch because what the Dutch had created was working so well. And Nichols could have, it almost came to guns going off. It almost came to violence, but remarkably, not a single person was killed. And Nichols wanted that because once he came to appreciate what the Dutch had done, yes, he could have leveled the city, but then he would have some real estate and he'd have to, rebuild from scratch. What he realized he wanted was this secret sauce, this thing that the Dutch had created in New Amsterdam. He wanted that to become New York. So that then becomes this really interesting merging of these two like-minded cultures. And that, I think, is the essence of what gives New York its start. I have one more image here, just a satellite photo to show you where this transpired. So this is Gravesend Bay, the little village of Gravesend. The reason he pulled in here was because the village of Gravesend was largely, it was founded by Lady Deborah Moody. It was an English enclave in the Dutch colony. Obviously, the Verrazano Narrows Bridge wasn't there, but this was the kind of field of action in which this little drama played out. All right, I'm back to Len Tantillo's painting here, and I think I've done pretty well on time, so I will stop my share. And thank you all very much. And I'm very happy to take any questions if there's time for that. Chet.
Yeah. So Russell, thank you.
Thank you.
So we're going to try to, if people have questions, you can say your question and I'm going to repeat them so Russell can hear them. But I'd be open to questions if people have questions. There's a question back here. Let me.
Well, I'm just so curious about the vision of Lower Manhattan with the canals. Was that what the Dutch had envisioned, where the city with canals, something like Amsterdam, and how they do that and conceptualize it in next?
Chet, I think you're going to have to repeat the questions because it didn't work that I didn't quite hear.
The question was, Russell, the image you had of the map that showed the canals, very interesting. Why did the Dutch conceptualize? Where did they conceptualize with those canals? Was it like original Amsterdam? What was going on with all that?
Well, those were two little streams, I think, or creeks that were there in New Amsterdam. And being Dutch, they had to have canals, but really, I think they functioned mostly like open sewers. So they had to put sheeting, the oak pilings along the sides, and then they had to reinforce them because you're in the harbor there, and when the tide comes in, it could flood. So they tried to build them up and protect from them, and also use them in a way that was, most logical for them. Obviously, they didn't have plumbing.
Other questions? Yes.
The Dutch created religious tolerance. English over that document saying can continue religious tolerance at work.
So I think the question is that you talked about the religious tolerance that the Dutch had and put as part of Amsterdam. When the English took it over, was a condition that the English also had to continue that religious tolerance.
That's part of what I'm talking about this meeting of minds between this faction of English society and the Dutch. The Stuarts were, I mean, you know, James Stuart, for whom James, the Duke of York, for whom New York was named, he was kind of a closet Catholic, and then later he actually converted to Catholicism. And being a Catholic in England was highly problematic. They were proponents of religious toleration, so that was an area in which these two sides saw pretty much eye to eye.
Other questions? You go back here.
When will the book be on the market?
So the question is, when is your book going to be on the market? Put the pressure on you.
No pressure, right? Well, I have to finish writing it. And no, I think it will, it'll be early 2025. It takes the publisher a year.
Okay, other questions?
Thank you. That's my favorite question so far.
And I understand that even before the English take over New Amsterdam, English settlers were coming from Connecticut into this area. Was there some sort of frontier between English settlers and Dutch settlers in what's now Westchester?
I think I heard that. He said, was there a frontier between the English and Dutch in Westchester?
Yeah, and focusing in on the part of the English in Connecticut from Hartford that were pushing west under their theory that Connecticut, under the theory of discovery, that their land stretched all the way west.
Right. The struggle throughout the life of the Dutch colony was over borders. And the backdrop in Europe was that both of these colonies, the English colonies of New England and the Dutch colony, wanted settlers. In the Dutch Republic, it was the golden age. Life was pretty good. It was kind of hard to convince people to come to the middle of nowhere. In England, you had all this strife, civil war, so lots and lots of people were coming to New England. And even though the Dutch had said, here's our territory, more and more English kept coming. So Peter Stuyvesant negotiated, this was one of his main objectives, was to negotiate a firm boundary, and they created what they called the Hartford Treaty Line. It was negotiated in Hartford, and it's essentially the boundary between Connecticut and New York. And then it is also essentially the line between Nassau and Suffolk counties on Long Island. That's it. The line went down there too. But the English kept pushing, and the Dutch, you can say this is your property, but if you don't have the force to back it up, then that was the subtext of New Netherland.
Hi. On the topic of Native Americans, can you talk a little bit about the military campaigns against the Native Americans and how those were administered?
Yeah, I think he's asking about the military campaigns against Native Americans. First of all, I think it's important to say that the Dutch knew that they were in North America to do business with the Native Americans. So, both sides, I think, wanted to do business with one another. Very quickly, the Native Americans, I mean, yes, the Dutch, the Europeans, not just the Dutch, imposed themselves on this landscape. But at the same time, the Native Americans very quickly got used to having some of these things that they couldn't make themselves, and so they wanted to trade for them. But repeatedly in New England and in New Netherland, wars broke out. And the Peachtree War supposedly started because somebody stole peaches. I mean, it's hard to get to what caused each of these wars. Kief's War supposedly began when Native American man recognized 15 years earlier his relatives were killed by some Dutch settlers, and so now 15 years later he recognizes one in a tavern on Manhattan and kills the man, and that then sets off this massacre by Kieft, who was the predecessor of Stuyvesant, as director of the colony. he sent soldiers to massacre Munsee Indians in 2 villages, murdered women and children in their sleep. This then set off this wave of reprisals, this counterattack, where Dutch farms were destroyed. Everybody had to retreat within the fort on Manhattan. So, you know, I think, and the warfare is the most visible, as it were, manifestation of this confrontation between cultures. But even bigger was disease, because very shortly after the Europeans arrived, the Native Americans were not immune to these diseases, especially smallpox that they carried. And, you know, estimates are that about 90% of the people died over the course of the Native Americans in the Northeast died over the course of the especially the 1630s. So, you know, you can just, there are some records of that. Dutchmen go, they're looking in a village to find who's the person here who we can negotiate with, but all the leaders have died, you know. So you can just imagine these scenes, this mournful kind of backdrop to European colonization that, you know, quietly changed the whole landscape and changed the playing field for the native peoples.
So is there one more question? Let's do this. Tanya, I'll come back to you. 2 more questions.
It's likely a little obscure. I was just wondering about, if I'm pronouncing it correctly, Shakopur Rock up in Woodhill Park. They say that was where the $24 transaction took place. Is that legitimate or just an old plaque that's been there for?
This is the plaque that's in the northern part of Manhattan. Is that right? Yeah, that, I think that is complete conjecture, because where this would have happened logically would have been at the foot of the trail, and that was the place that was most revered to the Native Americans, and that was where New Amsterdam was. So it would have been probably just outside the fort at the beginning of Broadway. That's the most likely spot. And I think the reason that plaque was put there was that in the early 20th century, excavation was done, and they found evidence of a Native American village there. So someone said, oh, this must be where they did that. But I don't think there's any more reason for that.
So I'm really interested in your feeling about commemorations. I mean, you have a 400, there's Lafayette coming back, and there's a commemoration. I'm involved with the 250th of the Revolution, the American Revolution. So could you speak about the value or maybe some of the downsides of commemorations?
You know, if this is the last question, it's the great last question. Thank you for it. You know, I'm working with the New York Historical Society, with the New Netherland Institute, and others, and this is a big topic. You know, we don't. I mean, 20 years ago, well, in 2009, Henry Hudson's voyage, there were celebrations. Celebration doesn't seem appropriate anymore, because it was not a celebration for, I mean, there was no cause for celebration for a lot of the people involved. Commemoration, marking, there, and I think that you know, what's underneath your question is that beneath all of this is what we as a society have to grapple with in our history, not just 400 years ago, but 250 years ago and throughout, is there are good things, there are things that we consider our values that we have inherited, and these ancestors did these things, you know, tolerance, the Declaration of Independence, and we have to find a way to value them, and at the same time say, some of the people that signed the Declaration of Independence were slave owners. How could you possibly, you know, create these documents while you had ownership of another human being? For the Dutch, how could you be a pioneer of tolerance and also, you know, found the New York slave trade, We have to be able to hold those two things in our head and separate them and say this. In other words, we can't kind of throw the baby out with the bathwater. I think you have to, and it makes it a little more challenging, but I think also much more interesting on the part of, when you're trying to put together an exhibit like I'm doing, the way where you give the attention, how you word things. It's where we are, and I think it's a good place to be.
Russell, if we can, I've got one more question, if I can. Just give me a chance.
I think we just touched on the question I'm going to ask. Why does the Dutch feel it was so important to have slavery as part of their economy?
Did she ask, why did the Dutch feel it was important to have slavery?
Yes, that is correct.
Well, money. That's what, and it wasn't just the Dutch, of course. The Dutch, the English, the Danish, the French, the Portuguese started it. The Spanish. They were. It was part of this. In the 17th century, you were grasping properties around the world and figuring out how can we make money from it. So we'll take this island in the Caribbean, and we realize that in that climate we can grow tobacco, but we can't, or we can pan for salt, but we're not going to do it. So we'll get these people. And so in the case of the Dutch West India Company, they first were bringing enslaved Africans to do that work. Then came the next step, which was, well, we'll also have a market in human beings as well, and we'll sell them to others who will use them to do work. So it was all about money and power and supremacy vis-a-vis other Europeans.
I think we're going to have to end now. Russell, can I just, I'm sure the audience will want to say it as well, but I just have to say thank you. It was a wonderful, wonderful time.
Thank you, Chet. Thank you all very much. Thank you all. And please have me back when the book comes out, and I will be there in person, I promise.
Russell, you're on. We'll have you back when the book comes out. So again,
All right.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate it.
Thanks.
Thanks.
Thanks very much. Bye-bye. And thank you, Pat.